My name is Faye Alderton and I am 31 years old. 3 months ago, my parents drained every dollar of my grandmother's savings account. The one she had been building for over 2 decades, the one she told me in front of witnesses, was meant for my future, and spent it financing my sister Roxanne's lifestyle. A luxury apartment deposit. A wardrobe overhaul. A weekend getaway to Miami that Roxanne livestreamed to her 4,000 Instagram followers like she'd earned every penny of it. They did it while Grandma Ruth was in a rehabilitation facility recovering from a stroke, barely able to hold a spoon let alone a phone. They assumed she was too disoriented to notice. They assumed I was too passive to act. They were both wrong. And the moment I told my grandmother what they had done, she didn't fall apart. She didn't plead with anyone. She picked up her phone, made one call, and by the time she was done, everything my parents thought they had built was standing on a fault line they never knew existed. I'll tell you exactly what happened, every detail, every document, every moment of reckoning. But first, if stories like this are the kind that make you feel seen, that remind you that you are not crazy for expecting basic decency from the people who are supposed to love you, then consider subscribing. There are more stories here that I think you need to hear. Now let me take you back to where this all began. It started on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, the kind of gray, damp day that Dunmore, Pennsylvania does better than anywhere else on earth. I was at work. I'm an occupational therapist at a mid-sized rehabilitation clinic on the north side of town, when my mother called. No greeting, just information delivered like a news bulletin. Your grandmother had a stroke this morning. She's stable. They're moving her to Meadowbrook Rehab on Friday. Family meeting tonight at the house. I asked if Grandma Ruth was conscious. Mostly my mother said. Then she hung up. That was it. No, how are you holding up? No, I know you're close to her. Just logistics delivered and closed. I left work early and drove straight to Dunmore General. My grandmother was propped up in a hospital bed, her left side noticeably weaker than the right, but her eyes, sharp and dark brown and full of everything she'd ever survived, were tracking the room with complete awareness. She knew exactly where she was and exactly who had and hadn't come to see her. My parents hadn't arrived yet. Roxanne wasn't there either. It was just me and Grandma Ruth and the sound of the monitoring equipment keeping its steady rhythm beside her. I pulled a chair close and took her hand and she squeezed my fingers with more strength than I expected. Don't make that face, she said, her speech slightly slowed but entirely coherent. I've had worse. I almost laughed. Grandma Ruth Alderton had buried a husband, survived a house fire in her 50s, and raised my father largely on her own after my grandfather passed. A stroke was serious, but it wasn't the end of her. Not even close. By the time my parents arrived, the attending physician had already spoken to me about the rehabilitation timeline. 6 to 10 weeks at Meadowbrook, possibly longer depending on her progress. My father, Glenn Alderton, walked in wearing the same expression he wore to every inconvenient family event. Mildly put upon, already calculating the exit. My mother, Sandra, was on her phone as she pushed through the door, finishing a text before she even looked at her own mother lying in a hospital bed. Roxanne didn't come at all. She sent a voice message that my mother played aloud in the hospital hallway. So sorry, I have a thing, sending love. And my parents nodded like that was completely reasonable. I stood there and said nothing because I had learned over 31 years that saying something only made me the problem. The family meeting that night was held at my parents' house in the Glenfield neighborhood of Dunmore. A 4-bedroom colonial that they'd bought at the peak of their financial confidence a decade ago. The mortgage had since become a quiet source of stress that neither of them acknowledged openly but that showed up in 100 small ways. My father sat at the head of the dining table with a yellow legal pad in front of him like he was running a board meeting. Someone needs to be Grandma's point of contact at Meadowbrook, he began. Handle the visits, coordinate with the medical team, stay on top of her needs. Roxanne is in the middle of her content launch right now, Sandra added, referring to whatever Roxanne called her Instagram presence that month. And your father and I are stretched thin with the Hargrove contract. My father looked at me. You're flexible with your schedule, right? Therapists have reasonable hours. I wanted to explain that my hours were not particularly reasonable, that I managed a full caseload of post-surgical and neurological patients and took work home 3 nights a week. I didn't. Of course, I said. I want to be there for her anyway. My mother gave me the smallest, most dismissive nod I'd ever received, like I'd confirmed something they already knew was true, that my time was simply less valuable, my presence automatically more available, my life inherently more rearrangeable than anyone else's in that room. I visited Grandma Ruth every day at Meadowbrook. Sometimes before work, sometimes after, sometimes both. We talked for hours. She told me about the savings account, the one she'd been contributing to since before I was born, a private account separate from her regular finances, started in my grandfather's name and restructured after he died. She'd added to it consistently for 22 years. By the time she had her stroke, it held just over $74,000. She had told my parents about it years ago in a conversation I hadn't been present for but that had apparently been explicit. That money is for Faye. For her education or a house or whatever she needs to build something that's hers. I remembered the way she'd pressed my hand at her kitchen table 2 Christmases ago and said, "I've taken care of something for you." I'd assumed she meant it in a general way. I hadn't known there was a specific number attached to it. 3 weeks into her stay at Meadowbrook, I stopped by her house to pick up some items she'd asked for. A particular cardigan, a small framed photograph of my grandfather, the crossword puzzle book she kept on her nightstand. I had a spare key. I'd always had a spare key. The house smelled like her, lavender soap and old paperback books and something faintly like cedar from the closets. I found everything easily. But on my way back through the kitchen, I noticed that the small decorative lockbox she kept on the built-in shelf beside the refrigerator, the one where she stored important documents, the one that had sat in the same spot for as long as I could remember, was gone. Not moved. Gone. I told myself it was nothing. But it stayed with me, a small splinter of unease I couldn't stop pressing on. 2 days later I called my mother and asked, casually, whether she'd been by Grandma's house recently. She said yes once or twice just to check on things. I asked about the lockbox. There was a pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "That's being handled," she said. "It means it's being handled, Faye. Adult things. Don't stress Grandma out over nothing." She ended the call before I could respond. I drove to my parents' house that evening without calling ahead. My father answered the door with a beer in his hand and the look of a man who had been hoping not to see me. "The account," I said. "Grandma's savings account. What did you do with it?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he stepped back and let out a slow breath. "We used it," he said simply. "Grandma's in a facility. She doesn't need $74,000 sitting in an account doing nothing." My vision went white at the edges. "You used it. For what?" Behind him, I heard the unmistakable sound of Roxanne's laughter drifting from the living room, bright and unbothered. I stepped inside without being invited. Roxanne was sprawled across the couch in a robe I didn't recognize, flipping through her phone, a half-eaten takeout container on the coffee table. She looked up when she saw me and her expression shifted, not to guilt but to mild irritation, like I was an interruption she hadn't scheduled. My mother appeared from the hallway, arms crossed, already defensive. "Faye, your father and I made a decision. We are her family too. That money was supposed to be mine," I said. "Grandma said so." In front of people. "Grandma is not well," my mother said. "She's recovering from a stroke. She's not in a position to be making financial decisions. So you made them for her." "We made them for the family," my father said. Roxanne needed a proper apartment, a fresh start. I looked at my sister. She held my gaze for exactly 2 seconds before looking back at her phone. "Maybe if you'd built something for yourself by now," she said to her screen, "you wouldn't need Grandma's handouts anyway." I stood there and felt the specific kind of loneliness that only family can manufacture. The kind that doesn't come from being alone but from being surrounded by people who have decided long ago that your needs are optional. I walked to my car in the dark, sat in the driver's seat and stared at the steering wheel for a long time. The rain had started again, soft and steady against the windshield, and I thought about every time I had swallowed something true to keep the peace in that house. Every dinner where I had smiled through gritted teeth. Every holiday where I had made myself smaller so there was more room for Roxanne to be larger. I thought about Grandma Ruth lying in that rehab bed, squeezing my hand, trusting me. And that night, for the first time in a long time, I decided I was done being optional. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on top of my covers in my apartment on Kellner Street, staring at the ceiling while the rain worked its way through the gutters outside my window, and I ran through the same question on a loop. Do we tell her? Grandma Ruth was 3 weeks into a grueling rehabilitation program. Her mornings were consumed by speech therapy and occupational exercises, Her afternoons by physical therapy that left her exhausted and sometimes tearful in ways she tried to hide from the staff. The doctors had been clear that stress was not her friend right now. Elevated blood pressure, emotional dysregulation, anything that spiked her cortisol levels, all of it posed a genuine risk to her recovery. My mother's words from weeks earlier surfaced like something dark floating up from still water. She's not in a position to be making decisions. And wasn't that exactly what I would be handing her? A decision, a crisis, a betrayal delivered right to her bedside while she was still relearning how to button her own shirts? But then I thought about something else. I thought about the way Grandma Ruth had looked at me the afternoon I'd found her alone in that hospital room, before my parents arrived, before any of the logistics had started. She had looked at me with complete clarity. Not as a patient. Not as a fragile thing to be managed. As herself. As the woman who had scraped together $74,000 over 2 decades because she believed my future was worth protecting. And I thought, if it were me, if someone had quietly helped themselves to something I had built and sacrificed for and earmarked with my own hands, would I want to know? Yes. Without question. I would want to know. The people who loved me would owe me that truth. I got up at 5 in the morning and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I barely touched, and I wrote out everything I wanted to say. Not in anger. Not in a way designed to devastate. Just the facts, organized and honest, the way I would want to receive them. I practiced saying it out loud twice before I drove to Meadowbrook. Grandma Ruth was already awake when I arrived, sitting up in bed with her crossword puzzle book open in her lap, a pencil tucked behind her ear. She looked better than she had a week ago. The color in her face had returned. Her left hand still trembled slightly when she reached for things, but her posture had straightened, and there was that quality in her eyes again. That particular, undeceivable sharpness that had always made me feel like she could see through whatever version of myself I was performing and straight to whoever I actually was. "You've got something on your mind," she said before I even sat down. I smiled despite everything. "I always do around you." She closed the puzzle book and set it on the bedside table. "Then tell me." So I did. I laid it out exactly as I had practiced. The missing lockbox, my mother's deflection, my father's admission, Roxanne laughing in the background, the apartment, the Miami trip, all of it. I watched her face the entire time. I watched for the flinch, for the fragility, for the moment it would become too much. It never came. Grandma Ruth listened to every word with the same expression a judge wears while hearing testimony. So, kind of processing without performing. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. The PA system murmured something distant in the hallway. Somewhere down the corridor, a television was playing morning news. He said, "How much did they take?" 74,000, I said. "All of it." She nodded slowly, just once, like she was confirming something she had already half suspected. "And the account, did they close it completely?" "I believe so." Another nod. Then she reached for her phone on the bedside table, and something in the deliberateness of that gesture made the air in the room feel different. She scrolled through her contacts with the kind of focused calm that belongs to people who have already decided what comes next. She found a name, pressed call, and put the phone to her ear. 3 rings. Then a man's voice, deep and even. "Ruth, how's the recovery coming?" "I've had better mornings, Bernard. But I'm clear enough for this." She paused. "It's time to move forward with the secondary arrangement. We discussed it 3 years ago. I believe the moment has arrived." A brief silence on the other end. "I'll pull the file today. Do you want it handled before you're discharged?" "Before if possible. Sooner is better." "Of course. I'll be in touch by Thursday." "Thank you, Bernard." She lowered the phone and set it in her lap and looked at me with an expression that was not grief and was not rage. It was something older and quieter than both of those things. Something that had been waiting. "Grandma," I said carefully. "Who is Bernard?" "Bernard Caulfield." Her voice was composed. "He's been my attorney since your grandfather was alive. He handled our estate planning, the property transfers, everything." "You have your own attorney," I said. I said it like a question, but it wasn't really one. She almost smiled. "I have many things your father assumes belong to him simply because he's never thought to ask." "And what exactly did you ask Bernard to do?" She looked at me for a moment, measuring something. "Let's just say," she said, "that when you have watched the same patterns repeat themselves for long enough, you stop hoping and start preparing." She reached out and took my hand, and her grip, still stronger than it looked, anchored me to the chair. "I need you to trust me for a little while longer, Faye. Can you do that?" I've trusted you my whole life, I said. He squeezed my hand. Good. Because what's coming will require you to be present. There's a gathering next month. Your cousin Delia's engagement party. It will be held at my house. She paused. My house, she repeated with a slight deliberate emphasis I didn't fully understand yet. And I need you there. I drove home from Meadowbrook that afternoon with my mind moving faster than the car. Grandma's house. I'd been there hundreds of times. A modest two-story on Cannell Road in the older part of Dunmore, filled with decades of accumulated living. It had always felt permanent in the way that only certain places do, like it existed outside of time and change. But as I turned her words over, the emphasis she'd placed on the phrase my house, I began to realize I didn't actually know very much about its legal status. My parents had always referred to it as Grandma's property. But did they understand what that meant precisely? I started wondering for the first time whether anyone in my family had ever actually looked at a deed. That evening I called my Aunt Patricia, my father's older sister who had always operated at a slight remove from the family's interior dramas, preferring observation to participation. I asked her as casually as I could manage, what she knew about the ownership of Grandma Ruth's house on Cannell Road. There was a pause. Then she said, well, it's Ruth's. Always has been. She never signed it over to anyone as far as I know. Your father asked about it once years ago and she told him she'd handle her own affairs. Thank you very much. He wasn't happy about it. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat with that information for a long time. My father had asked about the house. Grandma had shut it down. And my father, who had convinced himself he understood the full geography of his mother's assets, had apparently moved on and stopped asking. What he hadn't considered was the possibility that she'd spent the years since then making arrangements he knew nothing about. The next few weeks were a quiet kind of difficult. I went to work. I visited Grandma Ruth every evening and we talked about small things. Her progress with the physical therapy, a novel she was reading, the crossword clue she'd been stuck on for 4 days. We didn't discuss Bernard Caulfield again. We didn't discuss the account or Roxanne or my parents. There was an unspoken agreement between us that the thing that was coming had been set in motion and now simply needed time to arrive. But the waiting had a texture to it, a low hum beneath everything I did, and I found myself noticing things I'd glossed over before. I noticed, for instance, that my parents had not once visited Meadowbrook. Not a single time in the 5 weeks since Grandma Ruth had been admitted. My father called on Sundays, brief check-ins that lasted under 3 minutes and involved no actual questions about her condition. My mother sent a fruit basket that arrived damaged and was mostly eaten by the nurses on the floor, which Grandma Ruth thought was funny in a tired sort of way. Roxanne had posted 3 times that week. A sunset photo from what appeared to be a rooftop bar, a reel about her morning routine, a sponsored post for some kind of vitamin supplement. She looked happy and expensive and entirely untroubled. She had not called her grandmother once. I also noticed, one evening while helping Grandma Ruth sort through some old correspondence she'd had me bring from the house, that she kept a particular folder tucked inside a worn leather portfolio at the bottom of her nightstand drawer. She didn't open it in front of me. She didn't draw attention to it. But twice she reached past it to retrieve something else, and each time her hand rested on it briefly, not protectively exactly but with intention. Like a person who knows exactly where the important thing is and is simply confirming it's still there. I didn't ask about it. She would tell me what I needed to know when she decided I needed to know it. That had always been her way. And I had learned, over the course of 31 years, that her timing was never accidental. She was not a woman who did things without purpose. Every silence, every pause, every carefully chosen word had always pointed somewhere. I just had to be patient enough to see where. The engagement party was on a Saturday in late November. Cousin Delia had been dating her fiancé Marcus Webb for 3 years, and the celebration had been planned for weeks. A casual family gathering at Grandma Ruth's house on Cannell Road, the kind of event the Alderton family treated as an opportunity to perform closeness they didn't actually practice. 30-something relatives, some neighbors from the old block, a few of Marcus's family members who were meeting everyone for the first time. I had been to dozens of gatherings in that house over the years, but this one felt different before it even started. Grandma Ruth had been discharged from Meadowbrook 4 days earlier, cleared to return home with a follow-up care plan and a visiting nurse named Colette who came by 3 mornings a week. She had moved back into her house quietly without ceremony, And when I visited her the evening before the party, she was sitting at her kitchen table drinking chamomile tea and reading the newspaper like she'd never left. She looked steady. She looked like herself. And when I asked her how she was feeling about tomorrow, she set the paper down and said, "Ready." Just that one word, and the weight it carried was considerable. I arrived at the party early. The house was already filling up by the time I parked on Canal Road, relatives I recognized from holidays spilling out onto the front porch with drinks in hand, the smell of food drifting through the open windows. Marcus's mother, a tall woman named Sylvia Webb, was helping Delia arrange platters in the kitchen. Aunt Patricia was stationed near the fireplace, sharp-eyed as always, already watching the room. I found Grandma Ruth in the sitting room, dressed in her burgundy cardigan, pearl earrings, hair pinned up the way she wore it for occasions she considered important. She looked at me when I walked in and gave a small, deliberate nod. The kind that means we are ready and we do not need to discuss it further. My parents arrived 20 minutes later. My father came through the front door with the broad, easy confidence of a man who believed he belonged at the center of every room he walked into. My mother followed in a wrap dress she'd clearly bought recently, greeting relatives with the practiced warmth of someone performing generosity rather than feeling it. Roxanne was with them, wearing an outfit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her phone already out, tilting her head at angles as she scrolled through what I assumed was her own profile. She hadn't been to this house in over a year. She walked through it like she owned it, trailing her fingers along the hallway wall, glancing around with the casual proprietary air of someone surveying an asset. Watching her do that made something tighten in my chest. She had no idea. The party settled into its rhythms. Food was eaten, toasts were made, Delia and Marcus glowed the way newly engaged people do, and for a while the whole thing felt almost ordinary. I held a glass of sparkling water and made conversation with cousins I saw infrequently and answered polite questions about my job. My parents circulated through the room with practiced ease, my father holding court near the dining table, regaling Marcus's uncle with something about the Hargrove contract. My mother laughed at things that weren't quite funny. Roxanne took a photo of the food spread and captioned it. From the caption I caught over her shoulder, "Family time heart emoji," which was rich given that she hadn't visited her grandmother once during 6 weeks of rehabilitation. About an hour into the party, Bernard Caulfield arrived. I recognized him immediately from the description Grandma Ruth had given me. Late 60s, trim gray beard, wire-rimmed glasses, a dark blazer over a collared shirt. He carried a leather document bag and moved through the room with the calm, unhurried authority of someone who had no need to announce himself. He greeted Grandma Ruth with a brief handshake and a few quiet words, then positioned himself near the far wall beside the window that overlooked the back garden. He set his document bag on the floor beside his feet and stood with his hands clasped in front of him and waited. I was the only person in the room who seemed to register that he was there at all. Grandma Ruth waited until the food had been cleared and the room had gathered into that loose, comfortable post-meal drift before she stood up from her chair. She didn't tap a glass. She didn't raise her voice. She simply stood, and the room quieted around her the way rooms do when someone with genuine authority decides to speak. "I want to say a few things before the evening gets too late," she said. Her voice was clear. The rehabilitation had done its work. First, to Delia and Marcus, congratulations. You are both good people and I am glad to have lived long enough to see this. Scattered warmth from around the room. Delia teared up. Marcus put his arm around her. Then Grandma Ruth looked at my father. "Glenn," she said, "I need to ask you something in front of everyone here and I need you to answer me honestly." My father's expression shifted by the smallest degree. He smiled, the automatic social smile, but his eyes went careful. "Of course, Mom. What is it?" She looked at him steadily. "Did you access my savings account while I was in Meadowbrook?" The room went very still. My father's smile stayed in place through what I could see was considerable effort. "Mom, this isn't the place." "I think it's exactly the place," she said. "I think when someone takes $74,000 that didn't belong to them, the place to address it is wherever the people who need to understand it happen to be standing." The silence that followed was the kind that has mass and weight. Marcus's mother looked at her son. Aunt Patricia went completely still. Delia's face moved through confusion toward something sharper. My father set his glass down on the nearest surface. His voice dropped to the register men use when they want to appear reasonable while communicating a threat. "Mom, you were in a facility. The money was sitting there doing nothing. We made a practical decision for the family. You were incapacitated. Sandra and I made a judgment call. Grandma Ruth nodded slowly. A judgment call, she repeated. Using money you knew was designated for Faye. Using it for an apartment and a wardrobe and a trip to Miami for a daughter who hasn't visited me once since my stroke. She said it without heat, without theatrics, just clean and factual, and somehow that made it worse. The blood drained from my mother's face. Roxanne stopped scrolling. That's not, my father started. Bernard. Grandma Ruth said the name clearly without turning away from her son. Bernard Caulfield stepped forward from his place by the window and reached into his document bag. Good evening, he said, addressing the room. My name is Bernard Caulfield. I've served as Ruth Alderton's attorney for 26 years. He removed a folder of documents and set the bag down. I apologize for the interruption to your celebration, but Ruth asked me to be present tonight because several matters regarding her estate require immediate clarification. My father's jaw tightened. This is a family party, Bernard. Whatever legal business you have, it can be handled in an office. Ruth asked me here. Bernard's voice was level. That makes it her decision, Glenn, not yours. He opened the folder. First, the matter of the savings account. Ruth established this account in 1999 under a financial instrument that designated Faye Marie Alderton as the sole beneficiary. It was not a gift to be administered by Ruth's children. It was a directed asset with a named recipient. He looked up. Accessing and dispersing those funds without the beneficiary's consent and without Ruth's authorization constitutes misappropriation. The precise legal term depends on how one chooses to proceed, but the paper trail is unambiguous. The transaction records, the withdrawal authorization, all of it is documented. My mother sat down in the nearest chair. My father didn't move. Bernard pulled out a second document. Second, I want to address this house. He held it up. This is the deed to the property at 412 Cannell Road, Dunmore, Pennsylvania. The owner of record is Ruth Eleanor Alderton. It has always been Ruth Eleanor Alderton. At no point has this property been transferred, gifted, or promised to any other party. I watched my father's face change. Not quickly, not dramatically, but I saw the moment the ground shifted beneath him. Because I suddenly understood what Grandma Ruth had been doing for the past 3 years. She had been watching my father treat this house like a future inheritance, had heard him reference it in conversations as an asset the family would eventually consolidate, had observed him behave as though her death would simply transfer her property into his hands as a matter of course. And she had said nothing. She had simply made sure that every document told a different story. Roxanne found her voice first. She looked at Grandma Ruth with an expression that was caught somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of genuine fear. Grandma, I don't understand what's happening. Ruth looked at her granddaughter with the measured patience of someone who has nothing left to prove. I know you don't, sweetheart. That's part of the problem. Roxanne opened her mouth, then closed it. Delia had moved to stand near me without my noticing. She reached over and took my hand, and I gripped it harder than I intended. My father looked at me then, and for one unguarded moment, his expression was not angry. It was something rawer than that, something closer to the look of a person who has just realized, too late, that they fundamentally miscalculated someone they had underestimated their entire life. I held his gaze and didn't look away. I had spent 31 years looking away. I was finished with that. Bernard Caulfield set the deed on the dining table where the food had been an hour ago, and everyone in the room could see it. And then he said, "There's one more document I need to present." He reached into the folder a third time. And the room, already so quiet, went quieter still. Bernard Caulfield reached into the folder a third time and removed a document that was noticeably thicker than the others. He didn't hold it up immediately. He set it on the dining table beside the deed and smoothed the top page with one hand, and the deliberateness of that gesture, unhurried, precise, made the room feel like it was holding its breath. 3 years ago, he said, Ruth Alderton retained my services to establish a revocable living trust. He looked up briefly, making eye contact with no one in particular. A living trust, for those unfamiliar, allows a person to designate how their assets will be managed and distributed both during their lifetime and after their death, independent of a will and outside of probate. It is a private instrument, and Ruth was under no obligation to disclose its existence to anyone. My father shifted his weight. Sandra's hands were folded in her lap so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. What does that mean for us? My father said. His voice had lost its earlier steadiness. It means, Bernard said, that the distribution of Ruth's estate has already been determined. Legally, irrevocably, and with full documentation. He opened the thick document to a tabbed page near the middle. Per the terms of this trust, the following assets are assigned to a sole primary beneficiary upon Ruth's passing, and additionally subject to specific conditions effective immediately. He paused. The primary beneficiary of Ruth Alderton's estate, the house at 412 Cannell Road, its contents and all remaining financial accounts, is Faye Marie Alderton. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then my mother said, "That's not possible." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Roxanne made a sound that wasn't quite a word. My father stood very still, the way people stand when their body understands something before their mind is willing to accept it. "It is not only possible," Bernard said, "it is already legally binding. Ruth established this trust with full mental competency, witnessed by 2 independent parties and filed with the county 3 years ago." He set the document down. "Glenn, Sandra, your names do not appear in this trust in any capacity. Not as beneficiaries, not as trustees, not as administrators. Ruth has managed her own affairs independently for decades, and this document reflects those decisions completely." My father turned to look at his mother, and something passed across his face that I hadn't seen there before. Not anger, not calculation, but something unguarded and almost childlike. His voice cracked on the single syllable. Ruth looked at her son steadily. "I love you, Glenn." She said it simply and without performance. "But love does not require me to reward behavior that harms the people I care about. You took money that wasn't yours. You took it from Faye, who has shown up for this family in every way that matters, and you spent it on appearances. That is not a judgment call. That is a choice. And choices have outcomes." My father sat down. He didn't choose a chair deliberately. His legs simply gave up their argument with gravity, and he found himself seated on the arm of the sofa, staring at the floor. My mother had started crying, not the dramatic kind but the quiet, defeated kind that comes when a person realizes that the performance is over and there is nothing left to perform for. Roxanne was still standing in the middle of the room, her phone hanging loosely from one hand, her face doing something complicated that I didn't have a name for. The rest of the room, Delia, Marcus, Sylvia Webb, Aunt Patricia, the cousins, the neighbors, had arranged themselves around the edges in the unconscious way people do when they understand they are witnessing something that belongs to other people entirely. Aunt Patricia caught my eye from across the room and gave me a single slow nod, the kind that means I always knew and I am glad it finally counts for something. Bernard continued, his voice maintaining its careful, neutral register. "There is also the matter of the misappropriated funds. The $74,000 withdrawn from Ruth's savings account was a directed asset with a named beneficiary. Under Pennsylvania law, unauthorized withdrawal of funds from a beneficiary-designated account carries civil liability." He looked at my father and then my mother in turn. "Ruth has instructed me to communicate the following terms. You have 60 days to return the full amount of $74,000 to a trust account I will establish in Faye's name. In exchange, Ruth will not pursue civil litigation." Bernard folded his hands. "If the 60-day window passes without full restitution, I will file on Ruth's behalf, and the matter becomes a court record. Given the documentation we have, I would anticipate a favorable outcome for the plaintiff." My mother looked up sharply. "We don't have $74,000. Glenn, tell him." My father said nothing. He was still staring at the floor. "The money went to Roxanne's apartment deposit," my mother continued, her voice climbing. "Her furniture, her trip, her voice broke off. Bernard nodded. "I understand. That is a problem you will need to solve." He said it with no malice and no sympathy, just the clean efficiency of a man stating a fact. "The how is not my client's concern. The amount and the timeline are." Roxanne turned to face me directly for the first time since the room had gone still. Her expression had cycled through several things and landed somewhere I hadn't seen on her before. Not the mild irritation from the night at our parents' house, not the breezy self-assurance she wore like a second skin in her online life. This was rawer than that. "Faye." Her voice was unsteady. "Did you know about all of this?" I shook my head. "Not until recently. Not the full picture." She held my gaze for a moment. "I want you to know that she stopped. Started again. I didn't know the money was yours. Specifically, Mom and Dad said Grandma had accounts she wasn't using and they were managing things while she recovered. That is the most charitable version of what happened," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected, without the heat I might have anticipated from myself. And I think somewhere you knew it wasn't quite right, Roxanne. Because you've always been smart enough to ask questions when things benefit you. You just chose not to ask this time. She looked away first. That was new too. The party, what was left of it, dissolved over the next 30 minutes. Marcus's family said their goodbyes with the gracious speed of people who understand when an exit is the kindest thing they can offer. Delia hugged me at the door and whispered, "I'm sorry you've had to carry this. I'll call you." The neighbors filtered out. The cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances on the porch and then dispersed into the November night. Aunt Patricia was the last to leave, and she paused in the hallway and took both my hands in hers and looked at me the way older women look at younger ones when they are trying to pass something important through the gesture alone. "Your grandmother," she said, "is the finest person this family has ever produced." "I know," I said. And then, "You run a close second," she said, and walked out the door before I could respond. My parents remained in the sitting room while Bernard and I spoke quietly in the kitchen about next steps. The 60-day clock, the trust account, what my options were if restitution wasn't made. I signed 2 documents. Bernard gave me a copy of the trust in a sealed envelope and told me to keep it somewhere safe. He shook my hand with both of his, said, "Your grandmother is proud of you and has been for a long time," and then he let himself out the side door into the garden without fanfare, the way he'd come. I stood in the kitchen for a moment alone before going back to the sitting room. The house was very quiet. The dishes from the party were stacked beside the sink. Someone had left a half-eaten piece of cake on the counter. Through the kitchen window the back garden was dark, but I could see the shape of the old oak tree that had stood in the corner since before I was born, its bare November branches reaching up into the orange-gray of the night sky. I had climbed that tree when I was 7. Grandma Ruth had watched from the porch with her arms crossed and said, "Higher if you're going to bother," and I had laughed so hard I nearly fell. I stood there and held that memory like something I was afraid to put down. When I walked back into the sitting room, my father was still seated on the arm of the sofa. My mother had moved to the chair by the window. Roxanne was gone. I heard the front door close quietly sometime during my conversation with Bernard, and she hadn't said goodbye. My parents looked up when I came in, and for the first time in my life I had the experience of walking into a room and feeling the power in it shift toward me simply because I had stopped pretending it wasn't mine. I didn't say anything sharp. I didn't catalog what they had done or deliver a speech. I looked at my father and then my mother and I said, "I'll expect the restitution within Bernard's timeline. If you need to discuss terms, contact him directly." Then I went to find Grandma Ruth. She was in her bedroom, sitting in the armchair by the window, the one she'd had since before my father was born. She looked tired in the bone-deep way that comes after something long held is finally released. I sat on the edge of the bed close to her and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on mine. "You did well tonight," she said softly. "I didn't do anything," I said. "You stood up," she said. "For someone who spent 31 years sitting down, that is everything." The 60 days that followed the engagement party were the strangest of my life. Not dramatic in the way the party had been. No rooms full of witnesses, no documents laid out on dining tables, no silences with mass and weight. Just ordinary days that somehow felt entirely different from every ordinary day that had come before them, because for the first time I was living without the low background hum of self-erasure I hadn't even known I'd been carrying. I went to work. I saw my patients. I drove to Kennel Road 3 or 4 evenings a week and sat with Grandma Ruth while Colette, the visiting nurse, moved through the house doing her checks. We watched old films sometimes. We did crossword puzzles. We ate soup she insisted on making herself even though the doctor suggested she take it easy. And we talked the way people talk when they have decided to stop wasting time on things that don't matter. There was a softness to those weeks that I hadn't expected. I had braced for fallout, for chaos, for a family in open conflict. What I got instead was a strange and fragile quiet, like the particular silence after a storm has passed and before the world remembers how to make noise again. My parents did not contact me directly during those 60 days. Not once. My father used Bernard Caulfield's number twice. Once to request an extension on the restitution timeline, which Bernard declined on my behalf, and once to propose a partial payment arrangement, which I agreed to after discussing it with Grandma Ruth. $74,000 split into 2 installments. The first due within 30 days, the second within 90. They liquidated an investment account my father had been quietly building for years. Money that had been earmarked, I learned from Aunt Patricia later, for what he had privately called the next phase of his business expansion. Instead it was routed into a trust account in my name, processed without ceremony, appearing in my documents as a line item rather than a moment of reckoning. I won't pretend there was no satisfaction in that. There was. But it was quieter than I might have anticipated, less like victory and more like the specific sensation of a door closing properly after years of rattling in its frame. Roxanne called on a Tuesday evening about 3 weeks after the party. I was in my car outside a medical supply store near the clinic when her name appeared on my screen, and I sat for a moment before answering. She didn't lead with an apology, which I respected more than I would have if she had. She told me she had called Grandma Ruth the week before, that they had talked for almost 2 hours, and that the conversation had shifted something in her. I didn't know about the call. Grandma Ruth hadn't mentioned it, which felt intentional, like she was allowing Roxanne the space to come to her own conclusions without prompting from either direction. Roxanne said she had been thinking about the patterns she'd grown up with, the way things had always arranged themselves in her favor and how she had never examined where that arrangement came from or who it cost. I used money that wasn't mine to use, she said. I know that now. I think I knew something was off at the time and I chose not to look at it directly. There was a long pause. I'm not calling to ask for forgiveness. I'm calling because I wanted you to hear me say it without anyone else in the room. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I hear you. And I mean that. We didn't make plans. We didn't declare anything resolved. But when we hung up, the quality of the silence between us was different from what it had been, and that felt like the beginning of something worth paying attention to. Grandma Ruth's decline over the weeks that followed was gradual and honest in the way that some endings are. The good days were genuinely good. She was sharp and funny and had strong opinions about the state of American crossword construction that she delivered with the authority of someone who had been completing them daily since 1974. The harder days were quieter, slower, marked by longer stretches of sleep and a kind of inward stillness that I learned to read not as withdrawal but as conserving what energy remained for the things that mattered most. I sat with her through both kinds of days. Colette taught me the practical things. I learned the less practical things on my own. How to be present without crowding someone, how to fill a room with enough warmth that silence in it doesn't feel like absence. One evening in early February she retrieved a worn leather portfolio from the bottom drawer of her nightstand and handed me a folded letter from inside it, the folder I had noticed weeks earlier and never asked about. It was handwritten in her careful, slightly old-fashioned script, dated 3 years earlier and addressed to me. I won't reproduce it in full because some things belong only to the people they were written for. But the essence of it was this: she had seen me clearly since I was very young. She had watched my family configure itself around my reliability, appointing me the responsible one, the available one, the one who absorbed inconvenience so that others didn't have to, and she had loved me for my steadiness while simultaneously understanding that steadiness of that kind always costs the person holding it. She wrote that the house and the trust were not a reward and not compensation. They were the concrete form of a belief she had carried for decades, that I was the one who would take care of things worth taking care of. She said she hoped I would fill the house with noise, that I would stop making myself smaller, that I would let my own life take up the amount of space it actually deserved. I read it twice beside her bed while she watched me with her hands folded in her lap. When I finished she said, "Good. Now put it somewhere safe." I tucked it into my bag and reached for her hand and we sat without speaking while the winter light moved slowly across the bedroom floor. Grandma Ruth passed on a Thursday morning in late February. Colette called me just before 7 and I was already awake, in the particular half-alert state my sleep had settled into over the preceding weeks, as though my body had been preparing itself. I drove to Canal Road in the gray early light, and by the time I arrived the house had already assumed the quality of stillness that a place takes on when the person who animated it is gone. She looked peaceful. I am saying that truthfully and not as the thing people say because they don't know what else to offer. The funeral was held at the church on Merritt Avenue she had attended for 40 years, small and simple the way she had requested. My father and mother were there, seated 2 rows behind me and slightly to the left. Neither approached me before or after the service. Roxanne sat beside them but made eye contact with me twice during the eulogy, and the expression she held both times was one I chose to receive as an opening rather than a conclusion. Aunt Patricia sat beside me throughout. Delia and Marcus were in the row behind. At the cemetery I stayed a few minutes after the others moved toward their cars, standing in the cold white February light, letting the quiet of the place do what quiet is for. I moved into the house on Canal Road over the spring. I kept my apartment on Kellner Street through April, some part of me needing the overlap, needing to know that the house was real and holding before I released the last version of the life I had lived inside my smaller self. In May I handed back my apartment keys and moved the final boxes into the back bedroom, the one with the window seat overlooking the oak tree. I repainted it the blue-green color that Grandma Ruth had once pointed at in a magazine and called sensible and beautiful, which struck me as the most precise description of what I wanted the room to be. The restitution funds arrived in 2 installments, exactly as agreed. I put the money aside and let it wait while I worked out what I actually wanted, which, as it turned out, was the most interesting question I had sat with in years. Some of it went toward clearing my remaining student debt. Some toward a clinical certification I had been postponing since before the pandemic. A portion I set aside for Delia and Marcus as a wedding gift, because she had reached for my hand in that room without being asked, and that kind of thing deserves acknowledgement. The letter from Grandma Ruth lives in the nightstand drawer beside my bed. Her nightstand. Her house. My house now, and I am still learning what it means to say that without immediately softening it. The oak tree in the garden came back in spring exactly as it always had, unhurried and unapologetic, indifferent to everything winter had attempted. I find I think about it more than makes logical sense. Some things are more permanent than they appear. Some foundations hold long after everything built carelessly on top of them is stripped away and returned to where it came from. And some people spend 31 years making themselves as small as possible because they were taught, without anyone ever quite saying so, that their fullness was an inconvenience. And then one day they stop. They simply quietly finally stop. And it turns out that the space they were always meant to take up was there the whole time, waiting, patient as an oak tree, stubborn as the truth, and entirely irrevocably theirs. 2 years. That is how long it took before the house on Canal Road stopped feeling like something I was borrowing and started feeling like something I had always been meant to inhabit. 2 years of winter mornings with coffee at the kitchen table where Grandma Ruth used to do her crossword puzzles. 2 years of the oak tree cycling through its seasons outside the back window. Bare in February, tentative in April, full and unapologetic by July, letting go again in October with the particular indifference of things that have been doing this long enough to trust the process. 2 years of learning what it means to live in a place where no one is keeping score of your presence, where the rooms don't require you to be smaller than you are, where you can leave a dish on the counter overnight without anyone making you feel like proof of something. A lot can shift in 2 years. More than you expect while you are inside it. The changes in my life were not dramatic in the way the engagement party had been. No single moment, no document laid on a table, no room full of witnesses. It was slower and quieter than that, the kind of change that only becomes visible when you pause long enough to compare where you are standing now with where you were standing before. I did that comparison recently, sitting at Grandma Ruth's kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the windows cracked and the garden starting to go gold outside, and I sat with it for a long time. The distance was larger than I had realized while I was crossing it. I finished my clinical certification 14 months after Grandma Ruth passed. The program was intensive and I had been putting it off since 2019 for reasons that seemed practical at the time and that I now understand were mostly about not believing I deserved the time it would require. The final exam was on a Thursday in April, 2 years to the month after the stroke that had started everything. I drove home through an early spring rain and called Aunt Patricia, and she cried for about 45 seconds before collecting herself and saying, "Well, it's about time," in a voice so much like Grandma Ruth's that I had to set the phone down for a moment. The certification opened a senior position at the clinic with a private office and a meaningful salary increase. I accepted it without negotiating myself down the way I would have 2 years earlier. That felt significant enough to mark. My father called me for the first time in 14 months on a Sunday afternoon in early spring. I was in the garden pulling weeds from around the base of the oak tree when my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen for 2 full rings before I answered. He asked how I was doing. I told him honestly, well, busy, better than I expected. There was a long pause after that, the kind that contains things neither person is quite ready to say directly. He said, "Your grandmother knew what she was doing." I said, "She always did." Then he said he was sorry. Not elaborately, not with a list of specifics, just those 3 words in the flat, effortful tone of a man who does not apologize easily and is doing it anyway. I said, "I know, Dad." We stayed on the phone for another few minutes talking about nothing in particular and then we said goodbye. It was not reconciliation, not exactly. but it was a door that had been sealed for 2 years, opening by about an inch. And I decided that an inch was something worth receiving without demanding more of it than it was ready to give. My mother has not called. I have made my peace with that the way you make peace with weather. Not by approving of it, but by accepting that it is not within your control and turning your attention toward the things that are. Roxanne and I have lunch about once a month now at a diner on the east side of Dunmore, equidistant between her apartment and the house on Cannell Road, which I noticed and appreciated as a gesture. She is working in marketing downtown with a recent promotion she told me about, with the specific quiet pride of someone who has earned something for the first time and knows the difference between that and having it handed over. She takes the bus. She has a therapist she sees weekly and speaks about with the honest openness of someone genuinely doing the work. We do not have the relationship we might have had if things had been different from the beginning. But we have something real, which is more than I thought possible 2 years ago. She asked me once whether I thought Grandma Ruth had planned all of it. Not just the trust and the documents, but the specific timing, Bernard Caulfield appearing at exactly the right moment in front of exactly the right people. I thought about it for a moment. Then I said she prepared for it. Whether she planned the specifics or just created the conditions for them, I think even she might not have been able to say where one ended and the other began. Roxanne stirred her coffee. She was remarkable, she said. She really was, I said. It was the first time my sister and I had shared something without one of us being elevated at the other's expense. Felt honestly like relief. Delia and Marcus got married in September, at a vineyard an hour outside Dunmore. I sat with Aunt Patricia and 2 of Grandma Ruth's oldest friends, Frances and Dot, who had known her since they were all in their 30s and who spent the evening telling stories about her that I had never heard, laughing until they had to dab their eyes with their napkins. Frances leaned toward me at one point with the confidence of someone delivering something they have been waiting to pass along. Ruth talked about you constantly, she said. Said you were the one who already understood what mattered. I didn't trust my voice to respond, so I raised my glass instead, and Frances raised hers, and we drank to Grandma Ruth while the band played and the vineyard lights came on in the early dusk. I kept the letter in the nightstand drawer until 6 months ago when I had it framed. Not the entire letter. Just the last 2 lines transcribed onto a small card in Grandma Ruth's handwriting, printed at a size that fit a simple frame from the hardware store on Merritt Avenue. It hangs beside the window in the back bedroom, next to a photograph of her at her 50th birthday, laughing at something outside the frame, her head tilted back, looking like someone who has decided to be fully present in the moment she is standing in. Some mornings I look at it before I look at anything else. It reminds me of what she was trying to tell me. Not just through the letter but through every choice she made in those final years. The trust, the attorney, the patient, deliberate way she had built something before she ever needed to use it. She had not waited to be wronged before she prepared. She had simply watched and understood and quietly made sure that when the moment came it would be met. It is late October as I write this. The oak tree has gone gold and rust the way it does every year, dropping leaves onto the garden in no particular hurry, making a mess it has no intention of cleaning up. The kitchen smells like the soup I made this morning from a recipe I found on an index card in Grandma Ruth's handwriting tucked inside one of her cookbooks. Chicken and white beans and thyme, the kind of thing you make when the days get short and you want the house to feel inhabited. The certification is on the wall at the clinic. The letter is in its frame. The money is in accounts with my name on them, doing the quiet patient work that money does when it belongs to the right person. I am louder in the ways that matter and quieter in the ways that don't. I take up more space and apologize for less of it. I have a house, a career, a sister I am slowly learning to trust again, and an aunt who calls me on Sunday afternoons just to talk. I have the soup recipe and the oak tree and the way the light falls through the back bedroom window in the late afternoon when the angle is right and the whole room goes golden. I have all the things she left me, the documented ones and the ones that cannot be put into a trust. And I have myself, which it turns out is the one I needed most and the last one I thought to count. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.